Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers. Here's a question that should keep the mind slightly ajar as the body begins to rest. What if most of your beliefs aren't yours? What if the thoughts circling in the quiet corners of your mind were gently placed there, not by logic or truth, but by repetition, by tricks, by soft hands pulling strings you never saw? Tonight we are exploring the forbidden psychological techniques that shape behavior, bend identity, and quietly steal control. Without force, without threats, just through understanding how the mind dances with itself. If this kind of quiet unraveling helps you sleep, like the slow drift of thought under soft candlelight, then please do like the video, subscribe to the channel and tap the bell, because we whisper these stories every single night. And while you're here, why not leave a comment with the time and place you're listening from? It's strangely beautiful to know where in the world these echoes land. Now breathe slower. The first trick is one of the most dangerous because it doesn't feel like a trick at all. It's called the foot in the door technique. It begins small with something tiny, innocent, a favor, a smile, a signature. But once the foot is in, the door creaks wider. You've already said yes once. Why stop now? Psychologists Jonathan Friedman and Scott Fraser ran a study in the 1960s that proved it. They asked people to place a small sign in their window that said, "Be a safe driver." Almost everyone said yes. Later, those same people were asked to put up a giant, ugly billboard in their front yard. Incredibly, the majority agreed. Why? Because they already saw themselves as someone who supported safe driving. To say no now would contradict their new identity. The technique works because of consistency bias. The human mind aches to feel coherent, unified, logical. Once a person says yes to something, they don't want to break that pattern. To say yes, then no, feels like splitting in half. So they lean forward, they nod, they comply. This is how scammers, cult leaders, abusive partners gain ground. Bit by bit, inch by inch, a tiny favor, then a larger one, then a sacrifice, all in the name of staying consistent. But here's the eerie part. This isn't just about manipulation from the outside. We use the foot in the door technique on ourselves. Every habit begins this way. A small choice, just one bite, just one glance, just one late night, then again and again. Soon the door is wide open and we're standing in rooms we swore we'd never enter. The second trick is its sibling in reverse, the door in the face technique. This one starts big, too big, an outrageous request designed to be rejected. But the rejection is part of the plan. Once you say no, the manipulator follows up with something smaller. And now, that second request feels fair, even generous. The contrast tricks the brain. Salespeople know this well. Ask for $100, get rejected, then ask for $20. Suddenly $20 feels cheap, even though it would have felt expensive if it came first. It's not logic guiding the mind, it's anchoring. The mind compares everything to the first thing it saw. This is why first impressions matter, why fake discounts work, why a $10 wine feels like a luxury when placed next to a $200 bottle. The first number sticks, it anchors the frame. Every decision after is bent around it. This is called anchoring bias. Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, two giants in behavioral psychology, demonstrated it. People shown random numbers spun on a wheel, guessed higher when the number was high, guessed lower when it was low, even when they knew the number was meaningless. The anchor still held, even when they tried to resist. That's the danger. You can know the trick and still fall for it. Another mind trick, more subtle still, is mirroring. The mirror effect. It's the reason people like those who seem like them. Same posture, same tone, same rhythm. It works because of mirror neurons. The brain has cells that fire not just when we act, but when we see others act. It's empathy at the root of evolution. A baby sees a smile, it smiles back. A friend crosses their legs, we do the same. A stranger leans in, we follow without thinking. When done deliberately, it builds trust without truth. It's how con artists blend into lives. They reflect the target's world until the target believes, we are the same. No need to be cautious. We are alike. Politicians use it. Therapists use it. Even predators use it. The technique is only as noble as the hand that wields it. But that's the lesson again and again tonight. The trick itself is never evil. Only the intention behind it. Even something as gentle as a question can become a trap. Consider the Zeigarnik effect. It's the reason unfinished tasks feel louder than finished ones. It's the mental tension that nags until resolution comes. It's why cliffhangers work, why people keep watching, keep scrolling, keep waiting for the ending. The mind hates open loops. It wants closure. Russian psychologist Bluma Zeigarnik discovered it when she noticed waiters could recall unpaid orders with precision, but forgot them once the bill was settled. This is why manipulators use partial answers. Teasers, promises, vague warnings. They open loops, then leave you wanting more. Your brain fills in the gaps, and once you start filling them in, the story becomes yours, even if it began as theirs. But perhaps the most quietly disturbing trick is the illusion of truth, the illusory truth effect. Say something enough times, and the brain believes it. Not because it's true, but because it's familiar. This is how propaganda works, how rumors grow legs, how entire populations can believe falsehoods simply because they've heard them before. Familiarity feels safe, safe feels true, and so we believe. In 1977, Hasher, Goldstein, and Topino ran a study where participants were shown true and false statements. The more often a false statement was repeated, the more likely it was to be judged true, even when people consciously knew it wasn't. That's how deep the effect runs. Even knowledge can't always stop it. This is why misinformation is hard to kill, why memories rewrite themselves, why the past isn't solid, because repetition is more powerful than reason. It shapes not just opinion, but identity. So tonight, as thoughts stretch and drift, remember this. The mind isn't a fortress, it's a sponge, and the most dangerous ideas don't break in. They're whispered in, slowly, gently, again and again, until they feel like home. They say knowledge is power, but the mind does not hunger for power. It hungers for simplicity, for closure, for patterns that comfort rather than challenge. This is why so many psychological tricks work. Not because people are stupid, but because the brain is lazy in a beautiful, tragic way. It wants to save energy, to survive, and so it cuts corners. It takes shortcuts. The next forbidden trick preys on this exactly. It's called the availability heuristic. It means that the more easily something comes to mind, the more important or likely we think it is. Hear about a plane crash? Suddenly flying feels dangerous. Read 5 stories about shark attacks? Now the ocean seems like a death trap. Even if the odds haven't changed, even if they were always rare, the mind mistakes vividness for frequency, emotion for probability. News, gossip, headlines, they all warp reality by what they show and what they leave out. 100 quiet miracles will never outweigh one bloody headline. And so, we live afraid of the wrong things. We avoid elevators but speed on highways. We fear terrorists more than heart disease. Not because we choose to, but because the mind takes what's most available, most emotional, most repeated, and uses it as its lens. And in that lens, truth distorts. This is the same force that powers the illusion of control. A gambler pulls the lever just right. A sports fan wears the lucky shirt. A mother knocks on wood just in case. We feel safer when we feel like we're doing something. Even if it has no effect. Even if the outcome is pure chance, it's not stupidity, it's comfort. Control is a sedative. When people feel powerless, they cling to rituals, to symbols, to anything that gives the illusion that they are still at the wheel. The psychologist Ellen Langer proved this with her famous lottery ticket study. One group was given random tickets. Another group got to choose their own numbers. When asked how much they'd sell their tickets for, those who chose their numbers demanded 5 times more money. Why? The outcome was still random. But the illusion of choice gave them a sense of ownership, the belief that they had influenced fate, even when fate doesn't care, even when nothing changed but the feeling. And isn't that the strangest thing? That we're more loyal to the feeling of truth than to the truth itself. Another technique exploits this same blind spot, priming. It's quiet, almost invisible, but it changes everything. Show someone a word related to aging, like Florida, bingo, grey, and they'll walk slower. Show them a word like professor, and their test scores rise. Show them money, and they become more selfish. The brain absorbs cues without consent, and those cues alter behaviour. We are not as free as we think. A person's mood can be changed by the colour of the walls, the font on a screen, the scent of a room. It only takes a hint, one flicker of suggestion. This is why advertisers obsess over detail. It's not about convincing the conscious mind, it's about shaping the unconscious. Because once the unconscious is steered, the rest follows. Another weapon in this strange arsenal is framing. Change the frame, and the picture changes, even if nothing inside it does. A doctor says, "This surgery has a 90% survival rate, relief." But say, "This surgery has a 10% chance of death, fear." Same facts, different frame. The brain doesn't notice the trick, it just reacts. Politicians, marketers, and lawyers master this. They don't lie, they frame. They shine the light just so. They tell the story from an angle, and that angle makes the same number feel like hope or horror. This is why statistics rarely change minds, because emotion lives in the frame, not the data. And humans are not rational calculators. They are meaning makers, story seekers, frame followers. There's also the halo effect, another trick of perception. When we see one good trait in a person, beauty, confidence, charm, we assume they must be good in other ways too. A handsome stranger is also assumed to be intelligent. A confident speaker must be competent. A smiling politician must be honest. It's not logic, it's glow. The brain lights up from one good thing and lets that glow spill over everything else. The opposite happens too, it's called the horn effect. One flaw and we see nothing but flaws. A stain on a shirt becomes a stain on their soul. A stutter becomes stupidity. We judge the whole by the part, and we don't even realise we're doing it. Even the people who know these tricks fall for them. Because knowing is not enough. These patterns live deeper than thought. They live in feeling. Another example, the sunk cost fallacy. It traps even the smartest people. The more we've invested in something, money, time, love, the harder it is to walk away. Even if it's failing, even if we're miserable. We stay in bad jobs, broken relationships, dying projects, because we've already spent so much. The cost is behind us, but the mind pulls it forward. It says, don't waste it. So we waste even more, trying to justify the waste that's already been. Casinos are built on this. So are toxic companies. So are half of the world's regrets. And still we tell ourselves, just a little longer. Just one more try. The longer we stay, the harder it gets to leave. That's the trap. But perhaps the most quietly devastating trick is emotional reasoning. It sounds soft, harmless, but it's not. It's when people believe something is true because it feels true. I feel worthless, so I must be. I feel scared, so this must be dangerous. I feel anxious, so I must be failing. Emotions become evidence, feelings become facts. It's the inverse of logic, and yet it governs so much of how we live. It's why people believe lies that soothe, why they reject facts that hurt, why truth feels cold and cruelty feels honest. Carl Jung once wrote that people don't see the world as it is, they see it as they are. And maybe that's the final layer of all these tricks. They don't create false beliefs, they just help people cling to the ones that already fit. The mind wants to be right, it wants to stay safe, and if that means lying to itself, so be it. So as the night deepens and the room softens, remember this. These are not tricks of deception, they are tricks of design. The mind is not broken, it is built this way. Every flaw is a feature, Every blind spot was carved by evolution, shaped by fear, sharpened by need. And now, in the quiet glow of self-awareness, the question becomes not just how to resist these tricks, but how many of them already define the person staring back in the mirror. And once someone begins to notice the strings, the puppetry of their own mind, there's a moment of quiet panic that creeps in, a suspicion. How many of their preferences were planted? How many of their so-called values were shaped by pressure, not principle? The next psychological trap deepens that dread. It's called the false consensus effect. The belief that one's own thoughts are more common than they actually are. It's subtle. It whispers, "Most people think like me," but they don't. The mind assumes that others share its beliefs, biases, even mistakes, and so it walks through the world expecting confirmation. When it finds none, it still believes it. When challenged, it dismisses the outliers. Leon Festinger, the same psychologist who coined cognitive dissonance, helped illuminate this bias. In experiments, people consistently overestimated how many others shared their opinions. Vegetarians thought most people supported their diet. Political extremists believed their views were mainstream. Smokers assumed others didn't think smoking was all that bad. This trick keeps people inside invisible walls, echo chambers made not of censorship, but of assumption. And when everyone thinks they're the norm, they stop questioning themselves. They become blind to their own radicalism, blind to their isolation. Social media only magnifies it. Algorithms feed more of what one already agrees with. Slowly, the world feels like it agrees, until suddenly it doesn't. And that crack between perception and reality is where division festers. The false consensus effect is how crowds grow confident, how fringe becomes fervor, but it's also how loneliness deepens. A person who feels something unpopular, shame, grief, guilt, assumes they're the only one, when in fact many feel the same. They just think no one else does, and so they all suffer in parallel silence. The next distortion is equally invisible and far more dangerous. It's the just world fallacy, the belief that the world is fundamentally fair, that people get what they deserve, that good is rewarded, evil punished. It sounds noble, comforting, but it's a trap. Because when something bad happens to someone, poverty, illness, assault, the mind scrambles to protect its worldview. It asks, what did they do to deserve it? Not out of cruelty, out of fear. Because if bad things happen for no reason, then nothing is safe, and the illusion of control shatters. Melvin Lerner, a social psychologist, studied this in the 1960s. He showed people footage of a woman receiving electric shocks. When they thought the shocks were real and unavoidable, they began to devalue her. They convinced themselves she must be doing something to deserve it. It was easier to blame her than to accept a world where pain could be random. The just world fallacy is why victims are blamed, why cruelty is rationalized, why suffering is ignored. It keeps the ego intact but cracks the soul. It makes people forget that luck plays a role, that virtue is not always rewarded, that sometimes the dice just fall badly. And still, we cling to the story that fairness rules the world, because the alternative feels like drowning. Another trick born from the same need for coherence is hindsight bias. After something happens, the mind rewrites the past to make it feel inevitable. I knew it all along, people say, but they didn't. They only think they did, because uncertainty is hard to hold. So the brain erases it. History is full of this. Wars, elections, disasters, they all seem obvious in retrospect. But before they happened, they were clouds of ambiguity, multiple futures still possible. The Titanic was declared unsinkable until it wasn't. The stock market crash of 2008 was predictable after it occurred. Every missed red flag becomes glaring only when painted with blood. But the trick isn't just about events, it happens in relationships too. After a breakup, people say, I should have seen the signs. They scour old messages, old looks, old silences, and retrofit them with meaning. They build a story. Because the mind hates chaos. It prefers a bad narrative over no narrative, and so memory becomes a tool of fiction. Another distortion of memory is the peak end rule. A person doesn't remember an experience based on how long it lasted. They remember the emotional peak and the end. A vacation with one magical sunset and a peaceful departure will be remembered fondly, even if most of it was boring. A long movie with a terrible ending feels like a bad film, even if it was mostly good. Daniel Kahneman again studied this. He found that people preferred a longer, painful experience if it ended on a less painful note, rather than a shorter one that ended abruptly with high pain. The end defines the memory, not the truth of the full experience. This is how people stay in unhealthy situations. They remember the highs. They cling to the good ending. It distorts the full picture. And so they return, again and again, to things that were only partially kind. This is also how manipulators operate. They end on sweetness, on apologies, on affection, and that's what lingers. The ending rewrites the story, even if the middle was filled with harm. And so another trap takes shape: gaslighting. A term now often used casually, but it has roots in deep psychological abuse. It's when someone manipulates another into questioning their own reality. That never happened. You're being dramatic. You always overreact. The goal is not just to confuse, it's to control. To make the other person unsure of what they see, feel, remember. Slowly, their grip on reality weakens. They start to ask, am I imagining things? Is it my fault? Gaslighting isolates. It dismantles trust, not just in others, but in the self. The term comes from a 1938 play called Gaslight, where a husband dims the gaslights in the house, then denies it when his wife notices. She begins to think she's going insane. The metaphor holds, because all it takes is repeated denial. The mind craves certainty, and when someone close says no enough times, it starts to overwrite the yes that was once solid. And if the gaslighting is subtle, laced with occasional kindness, it becomes even more powerful, because then the target believes they must be the problem. That's the final twist of so many psychological tricks. They don't just change behavior, they change identity. A person becomes the thing the manipulator says they are. Broken, fragile, overreacting. It becomes a loop. The person doubts themselves, which makes them easier to manipulate, which leads to more self-doubt. And all the while, the one pulling the strings smiles, innocent, calm, certain, because they don't need to fight. They only need to make the other person question. Once doubt is seeded, control blooms. And that is perhaps the most chilling insight of all. The most powerful psychological tricks are not the ones that force, but the ones that whisper. The ones that change not what we do, but how we see ourselves. And when the self is shaped, everything else follows. Beliefs, choices, even love. And once the identity has been altered, even slightly, the spiral deepens without resistance. This is where the next forbidden trick reveals its shadow: labeling theory. The idea that the labels people are given or give themselves can shape their behavior more than their nature ever did. Call a child a troublemaker, and they begin to fulfill it. Label someone a genius, and they rise to match it or break under the pressure. Sociologist Howard Becker studied this in the context of deviance. When society labels someone as a criminal, they are more likely to reoffend. Not because they are inherently bad, but because they are now cast in that role. It's easier to become the mask than to keep explaining it away. The label creates the lens through which others see us, and eventually, how we see ourselves. And once that loop is closed, it's incredibly hard to break. It echoes the ancient concept of the self-fulfilling prophecy. The belief creates the outcome. Expect someone to be unfriendly, treat them coldly, and they respond in kind. Now the belief is confirmed, but it was never true. It was made true. Teachers told to expect higher performance from randomly selected students based on nothing but false data, watched those students actually improve. This study, known as the Pygmalion effect, revealed something strange, that belief in another's potential can lift it into reality. But the inverse is also true. The golem effect shows that negative expectations lower performance. If someone important expects failure, failure becomes likely. We are mirrors to each other, and what's reflected back can build or break a soul. This leads into the next psychological trick, learned helplessness. Coined by psychologist Martin Seligman in the 1960s, it came from a haunting experiment. Dogs were placed in a box where they were shocked, with no way to escape. Later, when an escape route was provided, the dogs didn't try to leave. They had learned that nothing they did mattered. So they stopped trying, even when the door was open. The lesson stayed buried in their nervous systems. That is the horror of learned helplessness. Once a person believes they're powerless, they stop looking for exits. They accept conditions that could be changed. They endure things that could be resisted. Not because they want to, but because they have learned that resistance is futile. This applies to humans in terrifying ways. Victims of abuse, employees in toxic jobs, students in failing systems. They internalize the futility, and so they stay. Not because they're weak, but because their mind tells them there's no use. And the more they stay, the more they believe it. This trick is used by systems of control all over the world. Oppressive governments, manipulative partners, even broken bureaucracies. All they need to do is break a person's belief in their own agency. After that, the rest is inertia. But here comes the cruel irony. The same brain that succumbs to helplessness also clings to the illusion of control when it shouldn't. It overestimates its power in chaos and underestimates it in captivity. This contradiction is what allows manipulation to thrive. Because when someone succeeds, they assume it was their doing. But when they fail, they often assume the world is broken, or worse, that they themselves are broken. The next trick presses deeper into this contradiction. It's called the spotlight effect, the belief that everyone is noticing us far more than they actually are. It's the reason a person feels shame about a stain on their shirt, or a stutter in a sentence, or a misstep in public. They imagine a room of eyes, a chorus of judgment. But in truth, most people are too busy worrying about their own spotlight to notice anyone else's. Thomas Gilovich, a psychologist at Cornell, demonstrated this with a simple experiment. He asked students to wear an embarrassing t-shirt and walk into a room of strangers. Later, the students were asked how many people noticed their shirt. They overestimated massively. In reality, barely anyone remembered. This is both humiliating and liberating. No one is watching as closely as we think. The shame we carry is often self-generated. The truth is, people are mostly thinking about themselves, their worries, their image, their own reflections, and that means the mind lives in a distorted theatre, believing it's on stage when it's really in the audience. This connects with another eerie phenomenon, pluralistic ignorance. It happens when everyone in a group privately rejects a norm, but believes that everyone else accepts it, so they all pretend. No one speaks up because they think they're the only one who disagrees. This keeps lies alive. It maintains cultures of silence. College students who think everyone else is more comfortable with drinking. Employees who think everyone supports the toxic boss. Citizens who think they are alone in their dissent, when in fact many share the same thoughts, but all stay silent because they assume they are alone. And so, the lie becomes the law, it becomes the culture, it becomes reality. This is how manipulation scales, not through strength, but through silence, not through force, but through assumed consensus. It's also why the spiral continues, each person waiting for someone else to say something, and no one does. The system wins, the abuser stays, the lie survives, all because no one wanted to be the first voice. And here's where the mind plays one more cruel trick: confirmation bias. Once a person believes something, they start to notice only the evidence that supports it. Everything else gets filtered out, discarded, ignored. If someone believes they're unlovable, They'll remember the cold glances, the rejections, the silences. They'll forget the compliments, the gestures, the hands that reached out. If someone believes a conspiracy, they'll twist every coincidence into proof. Every contradiction becomes part of the cover-up. The mind doesn't want truth, it wants to be right. It builds a case, not a question. And that means once a belief takes root, it's incredibly hard to change. Logic bounces off. Facts feel like attacks. And so, people dig deeper. They double down. They isolate. And what began as a simple trick of perception becomes an entire worldview. That is the power of confirmation bias. It doesn't just distort truth. It replaces it. It builds a new reality and locks the door from the inside. The scariest part is that no one sees it happening. They believe they are thinking clearly. They believe they are seeing the world as it is. But in truth, they're only seeing the parts that match the map they already have. And that map was drawn by memory, emotion, bias, pain. The journey back to objectivity is not a walk, it is a climb. And most never start it, not because they are incapable, but because they don't know they're lost. And the further one wanders through this hall of mental mirrors, the more disorienting it becomes to separate truth from echo, clarity from comfort. Because the next forbidden technique doesn't just blur the line between opinion and fact, it destroys it entirely. It's called cognitive dissonance, the sharp psychological tension that occurs when someone holds two conflicting beliefs at the same time. To resolve the discomfort, the mind doesn't change the world. It changes the belief, or buries it, or twists the facts until they fit the feeling. This mechanism is not just a glitch in thought, it is the foundation of many decisions, many rationalizations, many identities. Leon Festinger, who first coined the term, conducted a study where participants were paid either $1 or $20 to lie and say a boring task was fun. Strangely, those paid only $1 were more likely to actually convince themselves the task was enjoyable. Why? Because $1 wasn't enough to justify lying, so their mind changed the memory. It had to, otherwise they would feel like a liar. The belief was reshaped to avoid pain. This is how people lie to themselves, not to deceive, but to stay intact. A smoker who believes smoking is bad might say, "It helps with my stress," or "I don't smoke that much." A person who cheats might say, "It's complicated," or "They deserved it." The dissonance between behavior and belief creates pressure, and the mind resolves it in the easiest way possible. Not by changing the behavior, but by rewriting the belief. And once rewritten, it becomes the new truth. This is how ideologies harden, how cults retain members, how even abusive systems keep their victims loyal. Because once someone has sacrificed for something, time, dignity, money, love, they must believe it was worth it. Otherwise, the pain becomes unbearable. So they convince themselves it's meaningful, that the suffering had purpose, that the leader is wise, that the betrayal was justified. Otherwise, they would have to face the horror, that they were wrong, that they were used, that they were fooled, and that is often a deeper wound than the lie itself. This is why people stay in groups that hurt them, why soldiers fight wars they no longer believe in, why lovers stay after the second slap. It's not weakness, it's dissonance, and the fear of what must be accepted if the lie is abandoned. From here, the descent reaches the base of influence itself. Scarcity, a principle so primal, it bypasses thought completely. When something is limited, it feels more valuable. When a door is closing, we run toward it. When an offer expires, we want it more. The brain associates rarity with worth, and so marketers, manipulators, and even governments use it relentlessly. Only 2 left in stock. Limited time deal. Act now or miss out forever. These are not facts. They are triggers. They activate fear of loss. The idea that value lies in what is slipping away, not in what is stable. In the 1970s, psychologist Stephen Warshall ran an experiment where participants were given a cookie. In one version, they were given 10 cookies, in the other, only 2. Those given the rarer cookies rated them as more delicious, even though they were identical. Scarcity changed perception. The same happens with relationships. Someone becomes less available, and suddenly they seem more attractive. A person who pulls away triggers obsession, not because they are better, but because they are scarce. This is also known as the forbidden fruit effect. What is off limits becomes alluring. What is banned becomes desired. And this is not a flaw, it's evolutionary. In ancient environments, resources were limited. Rarity meant survival. And so our brains evolved to chase what disappears, even if it hurts, even if it lies. And this makes scarcity one of the most powerful psychological levers ever discovered. It does not argue, it does not persuade, it simply makes us want, and want hard. But sometimes, people don't need scarcity to feel panic. Sometimes, all it takes is randomness, unpredictable rewards, variable reinforcement. This is the psychological trick behind slot machines and social media. When a reward is random, not guaranteed, the brain becomes obsessed. It checks, refreshes, tries again. Dopamine surges not when we get the reward, but when we think we might. This is the addiction loop. A rat presses a lever and sometimes gets food. It presses obsessively. A human checks their phone and sometimes gets a like. They check again and again. This intermittent reward system is more addictive than consistent rewards. It hijacks attention, it creates compulsion. Casinos know this, social platforms know this. So do certain people. Toxic partners who alternate between cruelty and kindness are more addictive than consistently cold ones. The brain gets trapped in the cycle, hoping the next pull will bring warmth, that the next text will be the good one, that the pattern will change. But often, it doesn't, because the chaos is part of the trap, and chaos creates confusion, which leads to the next manipulation, information overload. When someone is given too much information, especially if it's conflicting, the brain shuts down. It defaults to simplicity, or authority, or the loudest voice. The trick is to flood the system. Keep the target too busy to think, too distracted to question. This is why some regimes flood their citizens with conflicting narratives, why conspiracies thrive on complexity, why manipulators talk in circles. Confusion becomes control. And when people are confused, they reach for clarity, which is where another trick waits: false binaries, the illusion that there are only 2 options. You're either with us or against us. You believe this or you're evil. You support this or you're brainwashed. False binaries flatten the world into extremes. They remove nuance, they silence dissent. And once someone believes in the binary, they stop looking for a third way. They stop asking questions. They simply choose a side and dig in. Because to switch sides now would feel like betrayal, even if both sides are wrong. Even if the truth lies somewhere in the grey. And once someone is dug in, their identity fuses with their position. It is no longer, I believe this. It becomes, I am this. And that's the final fatal step. Once belief becomes identity, it is defended like flesh. Attacks on the idea feel like attacks on the self. And so logic no longer works. Facts bounce off. Debates harden minds instead of opening them. Because now it's personal. The belief is the body, the tribe, the home. And if it falls, the self goes with it. So the walls go up, the stories get louder, and the tricks continue. Not because someone is manipulating them anymore, but because the person has learned to do it to themselves. And the most haunting part of all is that once a belief becomes identity, and identity hardens into armor, the person no longer needs an outside manipulator to guide them. They become their own captor, their own echo chamber, their own gaslight. The enemy is no longer out there, whispering lies. It is within. It is familiar. It sounds like self-preservation, and it uses the next forbidden tactic to full effect: emotional contagion. It's the eerie, invisible spread of emotion from one person to another. You walk into a room and feel tension, even before anyone speaks. You speak to someone anxious and soon feel it too. Emotion is viral. Mirror neurons in the brain copy the state of others without consent. We laugh when others laugh. We wince when they cry. We carry moods like perfume, lingering long after the source is gone. This is why panic spreads faster than facts. Why riots begin. Why cults swell. One emotion, repeated, amplified, reflected, until it becomes the dominant climate of a group. It's why workplaces can become toxic without a single clear villain. Why families carry dread through generations. Why a manipulator only needs to stay calm while others unravel, to appear sane while sowing madness. And the more sensitive a person is, the more susceptible they become. Because their empathy is a doorway, and emotion walks right through. But even those who resist emotional contagion fall prey to something older, deeper, group polarization. The tendency for people, when surrounded by like-minded others, to adopt more extreme versions of their original beliefs. Put mildly conservative people together, they become very conservative. Put slightly angry people together, they become a mob. It's not just agreement that does this, it's the desire to belong, to fit, to signal loyalty. So people exaggerate their stance slightly to match what they think the group expects. But everyone does it, and the entire group shifts. And now, the belief that began in the center has drifted to the edge, but no one noticed, because they drifted together. This effect is why online communities radicalize, why forums become echo chambers, why reasonable people start saying unreasonable things, slowly, incrementally, until their past self would barely recognize their present, and still they believe they are centered. Because everyone around them agrees. An agreement feels like truth, but it's not. It's just comfort, and comfort is the perfect breeding ground for manipulation. The next forbidden trick blooms there, in that warmth. It's called the foot in the door technique. Ask for something small, harmless, get agreement, then ask for something bigger and bigger. The first yes makes the second easier, and so on. Until the final request would have once been unthinkable, but now feels natural. Salespeople use this, so do cults, so do abusers. A compliment turns into a favor turns into a secret turns into a sacrifice. And because the person agreed all along the way, they feel they must continue. Otherwise, they would have to admit they were manipulated, and that dissonance is too painful. So they stay, they comply, they justify. This is also mirrored in the door-in-the-face technique. The inverse. Start with a huge request. Get a number. Then ask for something smaller. Now it feels reasonable, because the contrast makes it seem mild. Ask for $1,000, then 50. The 50 feels like a relief, even though it's still a lot. This is how charities, companies, and clever individuals steer decisions. They use comparison, not logic. And the brain falls for it. Because we do not judge things in isolation, we judge them in contrast, which leads to the anchoring effect. The first number heard becomes the anchor, even if it's absurd. Ask two groups to estimate Gandhi's age when he died. One is asked, was he older or younger than 9? The other, was he older or younger than 140? Both groups give wildly different answers because their minds anchor to the first number, even if it's nonsense. This trick works everywhere, in salaries, in pricing, in politics. Set the anchor, and all future judgments bend around it, even if it's wrong, especially if it's wrong. Because the brain doesn't want to calculate, it wants to reference. This is why first impressions matter so much. They are the anchor. They frame all future interpretation. A person seen as cold stays cold in the mind, even when they warm. A person framed as charming is forgiven flaws. Anchoring creates inertia, and inertia keeps people trapped in patterns they might otherwise question. The next trap is one of effort. It's called the effort justification effect. When someone works hard for something, they believe it must be worth it. Otherwise, the effort feels wasted. And the brain cannot bear that, so it inflates the value. This is why grueling hazing rituals make people love their group more. Why expensive items feel better. Why hard-won love feels deeper. It's not always about the thing, it's about the pain endured to get it. The mind says, I suffered, therefore it matters. But this trick makes people stay in situations they should leave. It makes them cling to sunk costs, to jobs, to people, to beliefs, even when those things no longer serve them. The suffering becomes the glue, and that glue hardens into pride. And pride is yet another barrier to truth, because pride protects the ego. And the ego is the storyteller, the narrator, the one who says, I am right, I am good, I am consistent. And the more the ego says this, the more it must ignore anything that contradicts it. That's why the next trick is so devastating. It's called reactance. When people feel their freedom is threatened, they resist, even if the threat was imaginary. Tell someone what to do, and they'll want to do the opposite, not because they disagree, but because they want to feel free. This is why gentle persuasion works better than commands, why resistance blooms under pressure. The more force is applied, the more rebellion grows, even in children, even in nations, even in minds. Reactance is the reason that even truth when shouted can feel like oppression, and lies when whispered gently can feel like liberation. It's not about the message, it's about the delivery, and that means the most effective manipulation is not force, it's seduction. The next layer proves that. It's called the Ben Franklin effect. People are more likely to like someone after doing them a favour, not the other way around. Franklin himself used this trick. He asked an enemy to lend him a rare book. After the favour was granted, the enemy's opinion softened. Why? Because the mind must explain the action. If I help them, maybe I like them. And the heart follows the action. We fall in love with those we serve. We hate those we harm. And so, behaviour writes belief. Not always the other way around. That's the secret. Change the action, and the belief often shifts to match. And once the belief shifts, the story continues, reinforced, repeated, remembered, until it feels inevitable, but it never was. And the terrifying twist beneath it all is that most of these tricks, these psychological snares and cognitive landmines, aren't even intentional. They happen without design. No puppet master, no sinister hand. Just patterns, loops, unconscious mechanisms coded into the architecture of thought long before language, long before civilization, long before choice. And yet, they can be used with precision by those who do understand them, especially when the next forbidden lever is pulled. Social proof. When people are uncertain, they look to others. When they don't know what to do, they do what others are doing. This isn't weakness, it's survival. If everyone runs, run too. If everyone laughs, it must be funny. If everyone buys, it must be good. This is why laugh tracks work, why lines outside clubs attract more customers, why products with more reviews sell better. The brain shortcuts its own judgment to follow the crowd, but crowds are not wise. They're reactive, they are emotional, and they can be steered. In 1951, Solomon Asch ran a study where participants were asked to judge the length of lines. The correct answer was obvious, but when planted Confederates all gave the wrong answer, many participants conformed, even though they clearly saw the truth. Just to fit in. Just to avoid being the outlier. That's social proof, and it operates silently, in every room, every feed, every dinner table. It tells people how to dress, how to speak, what to believe. Not because they believe it, but because they don't want to be the only one who doesn't. But there's a darker extension of this revealed in Stanley Milgram's obedience experiments. Participants were told to administer electric shocks to a stranger, escalating in intensity, simply because an authority figure in a lab coat told them to. Most people complied, even when the victim screamed, even when they begged, even when the machine said danger, severe shock. Why? Because someone told them to. Because authority was present. Because responsibility had been shifted. This is the power of perceived authority. It overrides morality. It doesn't matter if the authority is legitimate or not. What matters is the costume, the setting, the symbols, a uniform, a clipboard, a deep voice. People obey not because they are evil, but because they are conditioned to obey, especially under pressure, especially when someone else is in charge. Hannah Arendt called this the banality of evil when describing the actions of Nazis during the Holocaust. Not monsters, she said, bureaucrats, ordinary people following orders, filing papers, moving numbers, and yet millions died. That is the horror of obedience. It doesn't require hate, just passivity, just compliance. And when social proof combines with authority, the result is almost unstoppable. The spiral continues with another mind trick, almost tender in how it wraps its logic around the soul, the mere exposure effect. The more we are exposed to something, the more we tend to like it, even if it's neutral, even if it's false. Just repeated presence builds familiarity, and familiarity becomes comfort. This is how songs become catchy, how propaganda works, how lies repeated enough start to feel true. Robert Zionk, a psychologist, studied this by showing people unfamiliar symbols. The ones they saw most often, they liked more. No meaning, just repetition, and the brain linked it to preference. This is why dangerous ideas can become normalized, why the absurd becomes plausible, why repetition is the real engine of influence. Because truth doesn't always matter. Familiarity feels safe, and safety is mistaken for truth. That's the quiet horror of the modern age. People believe what they recognize, not what is verified. And so the repetition becomes the message. The echo becomes the proof. But there is another trick nestled between certainty and shame. It's called the halo effect. When we admire one quality in a person, we assume the rest must be admirable too. A beautiful person is seen as smarter, kinder, more competent. A confident speaker is assumed to be trustworthy. A wealthy man must be wise. It's a distortion of character judgment, but it happens instantly, automatically. This is how charisma becomes a weapon. How good looks deflect criticism. How predators disguise themselves as heroes. One glowing trait casts light on the others, and the mind, lazy and trusting, believes the glow. The halo becomes a shield, and it blocks scrutiny. This is why cult leaders are often charming, why abusive partners begin as magnetic, why frauds flourish, because once the halo is fixed, the flaws are filtered out. People don't see the warning signs, or they explain them away. He's just under stress. She didn't mean it like that. They've done so, much good, and so the lie lives behind the light. Another trick tied to this is the horns effect, the inverse. One negative trait darkens the rest. Someone rude is assumed to be incompetent. Someone unattractive is seen as less intelligent. Someone poor must be lazy. The flaw spreads like ink. And so judgments are rarely fair. They are flavoured, framed, filtered through the first impression, which becomes the lens through which all future actions are seen. And that lens rarely changes, because to change it would be to admit error. And the ego resists that. The ego, the voice in the mind that must always be right, that must always be consistent, plays its final trick, the illusion of transparency. The belief that others can see what we feel, that our anxiety is obvious, that our guilt is visible, that our thoughts leak out, but they don't. Most people are far less perceptive than we think. The mind projects its own state onto others, but they are wrapped in their own mirrors, their own voices, their own fog. This illusion fuels self-consciousness. It creates false shame. It makes people hide when they could speak, apologize when no harm was done, because they assume judgment is happening. But usually, it's not. Usually, no one notices. Everyone is too busy hiding themselves. The final trick, quiet and devastating, is ego depletion. The idea that willpower is a finite resource, that the more decisions one makes, the weaker their self-control becomes. This has been debated in recent years, but the original studies by Roy Baumeister showed that people who resisted temptation for a while, like not eating cookies, performed worse on later tasks. Their discipline had been drained. This suggests that exhaustion is not just physical, but psychological. That every small act of self-control adds up, until eventually the system collapses, and the person gives in to cravings, to anger, to despair. This is why people snap, why they make impulsive decisions after long restraint. It's not always weakness, it's depletion, and manipulators know this. They wear down their target, not all at once, but slowly. Tiny demands, tiny arguments, tiny humiliations, until the person no longer has the strength to resist. They say yes, not because they agree, but because they're tired. And tiredness, more than fear, is the soil where control grows deepest. The sleepy mind accepts what the sharp mind rejects. It's not just a metaphor, it's a strategy. And so it becomes clear that control, in the psychological sense, is rarely about force. It's about erosion. The mind doesn't break under sudden weight. It wears down like stone under a soft, endless drip. And the next forbidden trick exploits this perfectly. It's called the familiarity heuristic, and it whispers a soft lie. That what is familiar is safe, and what is unfamiliar is dangerous. The mind clings to the known, even if the known is harmful. It avoids the unknown, even if the unknown holds freedom. People stay in toxic jobs, cruel relationships, self-destructive habits, not because they love them, but because they know them. And that knowing feels like a shield. This is why change feels like death. It is not just about new outcomes, it's about stepping into mental darkness, where there are no scripts, no patterns, no predictions. The brain fears that. It was built for patterns, for shortcuts, for certainty. And so it holds onto the familiar, the repeating, the remembered. This is why nostalgia is so powerful. It makes the past seem better than it was. It smooths the edges, softens the pain. Even traumatic memories, once repeated enough, become warm in their predictability. This is how people romanticize their own prisons, how nations long for the good old days that never truly existed, how ex-lovers, once toxic, are remembered through a fog of longing. The familiarity heuristic is not logic, it's comfort disguised as truth. And when combined with another trick, status quo bias, it becomes even stronger. Status quo bias is the tendency to prefer things as they are, even if they're flawed, even if better options exist. The current state becomes the benchmark. Anything different feels risky. Loss looms larger than gain. And so people stay, they delay, they justify, not because they're convinced, but because they're exhausted. Because changing paths requires effort, requires risk, requires admitting that the current road might be wrong. And that admission burns, because it brings regret. And regret is one of the heaviest emotions the mind knows. It rewrites the past in brutal detail, replaying choices that can't be undone. And the mind, to protect itself, avoids decisions that could lead to regret. This is called anticipated regret. And it leads to paralysis, to indecision, to staying stuck. Because doing nothing feels safer than doing something wrong. But in doing nothing, people still choose. They just don't see it that way. The next layer of manipulation plays on this blindness. It's called framing. The way information is presented changes how it's perceived. This meat is 80% lean, sounds better than 20% fat. 90% survive, feels safer than 10% die. Even though both are true, the emotional tone changes everything. Politicians, advertisers, even doctors use framing to shape perception. It's not lying, it's tilting. And the mind, craving simplicity, slides in the direction of the frame. This is why words matter. Why propaganda doesn't need to invent facts. It just needs to rearrange them. Make fear sound like safety. make cruelty sound like strength, make obedience sound like unity, and the brain, overloaded and tired, accepts the simpler story, because the alternative is cognitive strain. And strain is something the lazy brain resists. This is where the next trick creeps in. The illusion of explanatory depth. People often believe they understand things better than they do. Ask someone how a toilet works, or a zipper, or a democracy, and they'll feel confident, until they try to explain it. Then they realize how little they know. This illusion allows shallow understanding to masquerade as knowledge. It fuels overconfidence, and overconfidence leads to bold decisions made on weak foundations. This is dangerous in individuals, catastrophic in leaders. It's why the Dunning-Kruger effect flourishes. Those who know little overestimate their competence, while those who know more doubt themselves. Ignorance breeds certainty, and the world rewards confidence more than truth. The loudest voice wins the room, even if it's wrong, because people mistake confidence for competence, and that leads to another subtle distortion. The availability heuristic. The brain judges probability by how easily examples come to mind. Hear about a plane crash and flying feels dangerous, even though it's statistically safe. Hear about a shark attack and the ocean feels lethal, even though the odds are infinitesimal. The news feeds this. It doesn't show normalcy, it shows extremes, violence, disaster, outliers. And so the brain begins to think the extreme is common. Fear blooms, risk is inflated, and decisions are skewed. This is why people fear terrorism more than heart disease, why they fear strangers more than loved ones even. Though statistically, most harm comes from someone known. The brain is not rational, it is emotional. And emotion, once triggered, overpowers logic, especially when layered with repetition. And that's where the sleeper technique waits. A persuasive message is delivered by a non-credible source, say a manipulative ad, a controversial figure. Initially, it's rejected, but over time, the content is remembered, while the source is forgotten. And now the message, divorced from its shady origin, is accepted. This is dangerous. It means even lies, if repeated and disconnected from their origin, can become beliefs. Time softens skepticism. Familiarity breeds trust, and the sleeper effect blooms. The mind remembers the song, forgets the singer, and slowly the idea becomes part of the furniture, part of the self. And once it's there, it's rarely questioned, because the mind no longer remembers where it came from. It feels native. This is the final mask of manipulation, when the lie no longer feels foreign, when the script is memorized, when the belief feels like it was always there. And who would ever argue with themselves? This is what makes these tricks so powerful. They are not just about others, they are about the mirror, about what the mind does to itself, softly, slowly, while pretending it is awake. But most minds are dreaming, not in sleep, but in certainty, in habits, in identities passed down, copied, reinforced. The way out is not easy. It requires suspicion, not just of others, but of one's own thoughts. It requires curiosity, the willingness to ask, why do I believe this? Who gave me this idea? What feeling does it protect? What truth does it avoid? Because every belief is a shelter, but some shelters are cages, and the door is often unlocked. But to leave it, the person must admit they were inside. And once that shelter becomes invisible, once the cage starts to feel like a room, the person doesn't look for a way out. They decorate, they justify, they invite others in. And that is how false beliefs spread, not just through influence, but through love. A person who feels safe inside a lie does not feel deceived. They feel protected. They pass it on to their children. They argue it with friends. They die for it sometimes. Not because it's true, but because it became home. And when the home is threatened, the body responds like it's war. Fight, freeze, flee. This is the emotional reaction to cognitive dissonance at scale. When an entire identity is built on a fragile foundation, every opposing fact becomes an attack. Every contradiction becomes a wound. And so the mind creates defenses, entire mental immune systems, to fight off reality. The next forbidden trick lives inside this immune response. It's called motivated reasoning, the process where the mind starts with the conclusion and works backwards. Evidence is not sought but selected, confirmed, massaged. Any data that supports the belief is welcomed. Anything that doesn't is dismissed, not consciously, but efficiently. The person feels like they're being logical, but the outcome was decided before the reasoning began. This is why smart people often believe ridiculous things. Intelligence does not protect against bias. It just makes the bias more articulate, more convincing, because the arguments sound sharper. The vocabulary is larger, but the engine is the same. Defend the belief, protect the ego, preserve the story, because to lose the story is to lose the self. Viktor Frankl once wrote that people can endure almost any suffering if they believe it has meaning. And meaning, in this context, is not truth. It is coherence, a narrative that explains, that justifies, that comforts, even if it's wrong, especially if it's wrong. Because the truth often hurts, it often isolates, it forces change, and change requires grief. The death of an old self, a ritual no one teaches, but it's real. And that's why the next manipulation trick is so powerful. It gives grief a mask. It's called gaslighting, named after a 1938 play where a man slowly drives his wife insane by changing small things in the environment, then denying it, making her question her memory, her perception, her sanity. Gaslighting doesn't just deceive, it makes the victim doubt their own mind. And once someone no longer trusts their perception, they become pliable, dependent, trapped. They ask for permission to feel. They seek validation for their instincts. They stop resisting, not because they believe the lie, but because they stop believing themselves. And once that self-trust is gone, anything can be inserted, any belief, any version of reality. The gaslighter becomes the only compass, and the victim spins endlessly. This trick is not always deliberate. Sometimes it happens culturally, generationally, through norms, through religion, through institutions that say, this is how it is. And if you feel otherwise, you're wrong. You're crazy, you're sinful, you're broken, but often they're not. They're just awake, and waking up in a world built on sleep is lonely. The next trick makes it even harder to resist. It's called the just world hypothesis, the belief that people get what they deserve, that life is fair, that good things happen to good people. It sounds comforting, but it's a trap. Because when something bad happens, the belief says, they must have done something wrong. It turns victims into culprits, suffering into proof of sin, and privilege into proof of virtue. It makes people blind to systems, to chance, to power. It makes them blame the poor for being lazy, the sick for being weak, the oppressed for not trying hard enough. This belief protects the illusion of order, but it kills empathy. It creates cruelty without malice. And it is everywhere, in classrooms, in families, in governments. The mind wants the world to make sense, but sometimes it doesn't. And acknowledging that breaks the spell, which is why the next trick puts the person back to sleep. It's called pluralistic ignorance. When everyone privately disagrees with something, but assumes everyone else agrees, so no one speaks up, the silence becomes consensus, and the lie continues. This is how toxic cultures persist, how harmful rules go unchallenged, how abuse becomes normalized, because each person waits for someone else to object. And no one does, so everyone thinks it must be right. This is also how groupthink grows. A desire for harmony overrides critical thinking. The group values agreement more than truth, and dissent feels like betrayal. So even when someone knows better, they stay quiet, because they don't want to be the difficult one, the outsider, the voice that disturbs the peace. But sometimes peace is the enemy, and silence is complicity. The next trick weaponizes this. It's called false consensus effect. the tendency to overestimate how much others share your beliefs, your preferences, your values. People assume their view is common, that it's obvious, that others who disagree are strange, extreme, irrational. This creates a distorted mirror. Everyone sees themselves as the norm, and others as the fringe. Dialogue becomes impossible because both sides believe they are the majority, the sane ones, the centre, and so the war begins, not over ideas but over reality itself. And when reality becomes contested, the ground under truth splits, and out of that crack grows the final trick: learned helplessness. The belief that no action matters, that outcomes are fixed, that resistance is futile. This concept came from a cruel experiment. Dogs were placed in a box with two chambers. In one chamber, they received electric shocks. In the other, safety. But some dogs were restrained and shocked repeatedly, unable to escape. Later, even when the door to safety was open, they didn't run. They just lay there, whining, waiting, because they had learned that nothing they did made a difference. And that belief stayed, even when it was no longer true. Humans do this too. After enough failure, enough betrayal, enough pain, they stop trying, not because they lack desire, but because they no longer believe in possibility. They become passive, apathetic, number. And this numbness looks like peace, but it's not. It's despair in disguise, and it is the final lock on the mental cage. Because once someone believes nothing can change, they stop looking for the key. But there is always a key. Always, even if it's buried, even if it's rusted, even if it takes years to find. The first step is remembering it exists. And once the mind forgets the key exists, it begins to decorate its prison. It calls it realism, maturity, acceptance. It speaks in quiet tones, saying things like, "That's just how it is," or "Some people are lucky," or "Nothing ever changes." But underneath those phrases is not wisdom, it's surrender. Learned helplessness is not insight. It is exhaustion that has convinced itself it is rationality. But it does not begin in defeat. It begins in control. In childhood often. When a child learns that no matter what they do, they cannot change the outcome, cannot stop the yelling, cannot prevent the distance, cannot make the love consistent, they begin to detach from agency. They perform, they people please, they numb, and the pattern sticks. It becomes personality. But it's not personality, it's strategy. A strategy that once kept them safe, but now keeps them small. And the adult calls it their nature, says, "I've always been this way," but they haven't. They were shaped, and what was shaped can be reshaped. But the first step is dangerous, because it threatens identity. And identity is armor, even when it's made of pain. The next forbidden trick exposes this even more clearly. It's called identity fusion, a psychological process where the self becomes so tightly bound with a group, a cause, a belief, that personal identity and group identity blur. The person would die for the group, kill for it, surrender all independent thought because their survival feels linked. This is seen in soldiers, fanatics, cults, but also in politics, in tribes, in social media swarms. When someone criticizes the group, it feels like a personal attack. And when the group thrives, the person feels purpose, power, meaning. This is not inherently bad. Humans evolved to bond, to belong. But when the bond becomes the self, dissent becomes betrayal, and the individual disappears. This makes people easy to steer, not with facts, not with debate, but with tribal loyalty. Us versus them. Good versus evil. It bypasses logic, it goes straight to the nervous system. And it rewards rage. The more someone attacks the enemy, the more praise they get. The more extreme, the more loyal. This is how radicalization happens. Not through argument, through identity. And once someone fuses, they will defend the group, even when it harms them. Even when it contradicts its own values. Because their identity depends on its survival. And the mind will always protect the self, even if it means lying. And the lies begin gently. They are called rationalizations, the next manipulation mechanism. When a person explains away their actions, not with the truth, but with a comforting fiction. I didn't want the job anyway. She was asking for it. I had no choice. These are not lies told to others. They are lies told to the self, to avoid shame, to avoid dissonance, to preserve coherence. The mind cannot tolerate gaps between belief and behavior, so it fills the gap with story, and story becomes truth, even if it's not. The longer someone rationalizes, the harder it is to undo, because now the lie has roots. It supports other lies. It's woven into memory. And memories, as we've seen, are not static. They are fluid, fragile, rewritten each time they are recalled. And so the past itself becomes distorted to match the current narrative. I always felt that way. I knew it all along, but they didn't. They're remembering through the lens of now. This is called memory reconsolidation, and it means the past is not a photograph, it's a painting. Repainted, retouched, sometimes unrecognizable. This makes gaslighting even more dangerous, because once the memory changes, the evidence is gone. The victim cannot prove it to themselves, and the abuser walks free. But even without abuse, the mind gaslights itself. It forgets, it fills gaps, it changes tone, and it does this to preserve identity. Because the self is a story, a delicate myth of continuity, of logic, of this is who I am. But who are you if every memory is rewritten, if every belief is shaped by culture, if every decision is influenced by fatigue, bias, mood? The next trick answers with silence. It's called the illusion of self, the Buddhist concept now echoed by neuroscience. The idea that there is no fixed self, only a stream of sensations, thoughts, memories, shifting, changing. The I is not a solid thing. It is a verb, a process, and when the mind clings to it, it suffers. Because it tries to freeze a river. It says, "This is me," and then fights all evidence to the contrary. But if the self is a construct, then freedom is possible, because nothing fixed needs to be defended. Nothing permanent needs to be preserved. Change becomes natural. Loss becomes tolerable. Control becomes less urgent. But the ego resists. It fears dissolution. It says, if I am not this, then I am nothing. But that's not true. The self is not nothing. It is everything. Just not one thing. And this truth, while liberating, is also disorienting, which is why most people avoid it. They prefer the illusion. It's simpler. It's safer. And in that safety, manipulation thrives. Because once someone clings to a false self, they can be sold anything that reinforces it. Products, beliefs, enemies, and they will defend those things, not because they care, but because they are defending themselves. This is the root of so much division, so much conflict, everyone screaming not for truth, but for validation. See me, agree with me, confirm me, and when others don't, it feels like annihilation. The final trick weaponizes this need for validation. It's called intermittent reinforcement, the most powerful conditioning schedule, the one that creates addiction. Give a reward every time. The subject gets bored. Give it randomly, unpredictably, and they get hooked. This is how slot machines work, how social media works, how toxic relationships work. Love bomb, then withdrawal. Compliment, then critique. Reward, then neglect. The person becomes obsessed, not because of the reward, but because of the uncertainty. The brain loops, tries harder, stays longer, because maybe next time, maybe it'll be different, but it won't. The pattern is the point, and the victim knows it, but can't leave, because the pain itself has become part of the rhythm, and the rhythm feels like home, but it's not, it's a trap. And still, even knowing it's a trap, most people stay, not because they like it, but because it gives them something deeper than joy. It gives them identity. And identity, even if it's painful, is familiar. And familiar pain is safer than unfamiliar freedom. So they stay, they scroll, they wait for the next ping, the next message, the next moment of attention. And the mind, craving certainty, starts to mistake unpredictability for depth. They must care, or they wouldn't still be here. There must be something real beneath the chaos. But no, chaos can exist on its own, and sometimes it's the mask of indifference, not intensity. But intermittent reinforcement confuses that. It makes the brain associate inconsistency with value. And so silence becomes suspense, distance becomes mystery, and the victim becomes the author of their own delusion. This is not a failure of intelligence. It's the brain doing exactly what it was built to do. Search for patterns, seek resolution, avoid rejection. It's ancient, it's primal, but it can be hijacked, and it often is, especially by those who know how to keep someone hooked without ever giving them what they need. Because what people need isn't more stimuli, it's clarity, consistency, care. But those things don't create addiction, they create peace. And peace doesn't sell, peace doesn't manipulate, peace doesn't control. So it's replaced with stimulation, with noise, with loops, and now the brain is exhausted. But it can't stop, because the loop has become the self. This is the modern mind, a sponge soaked in input, dripping in contradictions, hungry but never fed. And the next forbidden trick plays directly into that hunger. It's called information bias, the tendency to seek more information even when it doesn't affect action. The belief that more data equals better decisions. But often, more data just means more confusion, more options, more doubt. Studies have shown that people often make worse choices when given more information. Because the brain overloads, it can't filter, it starts to spin. And in that spin, it delays, it avoids, it defers responsibility. I need to know more before I decide. But that knowing never ends, because the information never stops. This is why people scroll endlessly, research endlessly, watch one more video, read one more article, but feel less certain than before. Because they don't want clarity, not really, they want escape. And learning can become escape when it replaces action. This is where pseudo-intellectualism grows. A wall of facts, a fortress of arguments, but no movement, no change, just loops. And the loops feel productive, because they sound smart, but they're just noise, mental clutter dressed as progress. And underneath it is fear. Fear of being wrong, fear of missing out, fear of choosing badly. So nothing is chosen, and the person stays stuck. This is the paradox of choice. Barry Schwartz wrote about it. Too many options make people less happy, more anxious, more regretful, because each choice is a door that closes others. And the mind mourns those other doors, even if the choice was good, especially if it was, because now it has something to compare. And comparison is the next trick. Social comparison theory. We evaluate ourselves by comparing to others. But in the age of the internet, those others are curated, edited, filtered, highlight reels, and the self, raw and unedited, always loses. Because it's real. And real can't compete with illusion. So people shrink, they doubt, they assume they're behind, failing, ugly, alone. Even when they're not, even when they're doing fine. Because the mind believes what it sees, and what it sees is a distorted mirror. This mirror is profitable. It keeps people buying, changing, adjusting, fixing. Not to grow, but to catch up. To match an image that isn't real. And the race never ends. Because the image keeps moving. And the self keeps chasing. Until exhaustion sets in. And then comes the next trick. Ego investment. The more someone sacrifices for something, the more they believe in its value, even if it's harmful, even if it doesn't work. This is why people stay in bad relationships, in failing businesses, in discredited beliefs, because they've invested time, money, emotion. And to admit failure would be to admit loss, to admit they were wrong, and that burns. So they double down, they rationalize, they recruit others to believe with them, to reduce the dissonance. And the belief grows stronger, not because it's true, but because it's costly. The mind protects its sunk costs, even when the cost is the self. This is how cults grow, how scams persist, how ideologies survive long after they've failed. The followers aren't stupid, they're committed, and commitment creates blindness, not physical blindness, but emotional. Philosophers like Nietzsche warned of this, that the deepest lies are those we tell ourselves to preserve meaning. And that meaning, once fused with identity, becomes untouchable, because it is now sacred, and sacred things are not questioned, they are defended, even with violence, even with silence, even with madness. This madness, though, is not loud, it's quiet. It's the madness of stagnation, of knowing something is wrong but not knowing what, of feeling stuck but appearing fine, of smiling while the soul whispers, "This isn't it." And the next trick, the softest one, ensures that whisper is never heard. It's called busy culture. The glorification of productivity. The idea that worth is earned through output. That rest is laziness. That idleness is sin. So people run. Schedule, grind, hustle. Not because they love it, but because stopping feels dangerous. Because silence brings the questions. And questions bring the truth. And the truth might say, "You're not okay. You're not where you want to be. You're not who you pretend to be." And hearing that would shatter the mask. So the noise stays, the calendar fills, the inbox grows, and the self disappears beneath it. But silence is not the enemy, it is the doorway, the only place the truth can enter. But first the noise must be named, and that takes courage. And courage, real courage, is not loud, it's quiet. It's the decision to sit with discomfort, to ask the forbidden questions, to notice the loops, to admit the manipulation, and then maybe to begin. And once someone begins, even quietly, even with trembling hands, the machinery starts to shake. Not fall apart, not yet, but tremble, just enough for light to leak through the seams. And in that light, the illusions can be seen for what they are. Not evil, not malicious, but mechanisms, tools, tricks the mind learned to survive a world that often didn't make sense. But survival strategies are not life strategies. What once kept someone alive can now keep them small. And that's the next trick, the moral weight of old coping mechanisms. The belief that because something worked once, it is good. That because a pattern kept someone from pain, it must be preserved. But protection is not the same as freedom. And most psychological manipulation does not come from outside. It comes from the self, repeating what once felt safe. Like a child still sleeping with the lights on, long after the monsters left. And this is where self-sabotage begins, not as a dramatic act, but as a whisper, a delay, a distraction, a missed opportunity, rationalized with logic. It wasn't the right time. I didn't want it that much. But beneath those words is often fear. Fear of success, fear of failure, fear of being seen. Because to be seen is to be vulnerable. And to be vulnerable is to risk shame. And shame is one of the most powerful silencers of the human soul. It doesn't scream, it shrinks. It says, stay small, stay quiet, don't try, don't hope. It wears 1,000 masks: perfectionism, procrastination, people-pleasing, numbness. But the root is the same, the belief that one is not enough, not as they are, not without performance. And this belief is not born, it is taught, through culture, through family, through school systems that reward conformity over curiosity, that punish mistakes instead of celebrating learning, that measure worth in grades, in productivity, in obedience. And over time, the child internalizes a formula. If I do well, I am loved. If I fail, I am nothing. And this becomes the inner voice, the script. And every risk feels like a test of the self, not of skill, not of effort, but of worth. And so the person avoids risk, not because they are lazy, but because they are afraid of confirming the secret belief that they are not enough. And this fear is the soil where manipulation grows. Because someone who doubts their worth will seek external validation to fill the gap. They will overextend, overperform, over-apologize. They will tolerate mistreatment. They will rationalize neglect. They will confuse love with approval. And the world, seeing this, responds, some with kindness, some with cruelty, but the manipulator sees opportunity. Because someone desperate to prove their worth is someone easy to control. All it takes is withholding approval, shifting goalposts, making praise conditional, and the person will chase. They will adapt. They will abandon their boundaries, not because they're weak, but because they were taught to earn love, not receive it. And the difference between those two is the difference between peace and war. This is why the next trick, love bombing, is so effective. At first, it feels like heaven. Attention, affection, intensity, a flood of connection. It feels like everything that was missing. And that's the point. Because it creates contrast, it awakens hunger, it builds dependence. And then, once the hook is set, the withdrawal begins, slowly, inconsistently. The coldness arrives like fog, the compliments stop, the texts slow, and the person begins to chase, not the abuser, but the high, the first feeling, the promise. And this is where cognitive dissonance twists into a knot. Because the person must now reconcile two truths. They made me feel incredible, and they make me feel terrible. And the mind doesn't like contradiction, so it picks a side. It idealizes, it blames the self. I must have done something wrong. If I try harder, it will go back to how it was. But it won't, because the contrast was the design. The love bombing wasn't real, it was bait, a simulation of connection designed to create dependence. And now, the person is trapped in a cycle, chasing a ghost, blaming themselves, losing touch with their instincts. And this erosion of self-trust is exactly what makes the next trick possible. Triangulation, bringing in third parties to destabilize, to create jealousy, comparison, competition. The manipulator says things like, "They would never treat me like this. You should be more like them." And suddenly the person is no longer just trying to be loved, they're trying to win, to compete, to earn what was once given freely. And the more they compete, the more they lose themselves. And the manipulator grows stronger. Because now they are the judge, the prize, the one with the power to validate or withhold. And the person no longer asks, "Do I want this?" but "How do I get it back?" And that question is the trap. Because it keeps the focus on the manipulator, not the self, not the truth, not the harm. And that redirection is the point. The next trick deepens it even further, projection. The manipulator accuses the victim of the very things they are doing. Lying, cheating, manipulating. And now the victim is on the defensive, explaining, proving, apologizing, and the original issue is forgotten, replaced by a whirlwind of accusations. And the victim, confused and ashamed, begins to wonder, maybe it is me. And that wondering, that self-doubt, is the collapse. Because once someone doubts their own reality, the door is wide open for gaslighting, for rewriting history, for complete control. And all of it, every step, is built on one thing, the belief that love must be earned. But it doesn't. Real love doesn't manipulate, it doesn't punish, it doesn't confuse, it doesn't make the person question their worth. And yet so many accept this confusion as normal, as passion, as drama, as depth. But it's not. It's damage. And the damage stays until someone sees it clearly, names it, stops chasing, and begins to ask new questions. Not, how do I get them back, but what am I missing that I thought they could give me? And that question, soft, scary, slow, is the start of freedom. And once that question is asked, what am I missing that I thought they could give me? The entire structure begins to tremble, not because the answer is obvious, but because the answer was never allowed to surface until now. The answer is rarely about them. It's about the story beneath the surface, the childhood blueprint of what love means, how safety feels, who one must become to be accepted. And those blueprints are not chosen. They are absorbed, etched into the nervous system, like invisible ink that only glows under the pressure of adult relationships. Many chase love that mimics their first experiences of affection. Inconsistent, conditional, performative. They confuse familiarity with compatibility. And that is one of the most sinister psychological tricks of all, the familiarity principle. The more we are exposed to something, the more we tend to prefer it, even if it's painful, even if it's toxic. It's called the mere exposure effect, discovered by psychologist Robert Zionk. He found that repeated exposure to a stimulus increases our liking for it. It doesn't matter if it's good or bad, just that it's familiar. And so people return to patterns not because they work, but because they feel known. The chaos is predictable, the disappointment is expected, and what is expected is safe, because it doesn't challenge the nervous system with uncertainty. This is how someone can feel addicted to a relationship that destroys them. It's not madness, it's biology, it's pattern recognition, gone rogue, and it takes immense awareness to disrupt it, because the pull of the familiar is quiet, seductive, nostalgic. It whispers, maybe this time will be different, but it won't, unless the pattern is seen, held, and gently undone. Not all at once, but slowly, with compassion. Because shattering a survival pattern without a replacement just leaves emptiness, and emptiness is terrifying. This is why many people relapse into old dynamics, not because they forgot, but because they were lonely, and that loneliness becomes its own manipulation. The brain says, at least they were there, at least it wasn't silent. But silence is not punishment, it is space, and space is needed for truth. And truth, once seen clearly, can never fully be unseen. It fades sometimes, yes. It gets buried under old instincts, but once tasted, it leaves a mark. And that mark becomes the anchor, even in relapse, even in confusion. The anchor whispers, this isn't it. And that whisper grows louder the more it's honoured, until one day it becomes a voice. And the voice begins to ask better questions. Not, why don't they love me? But why do I keep choosing those who can't? Not, how do I fix this? But what do I believe I deserve? These questions break the spell. They return agency to the self. And that is dangerous to systems built on control. This is why another manipulation trick appears when someone starts to pull away. It's called reactive abuse. The manipulator pushes the victim to the edge, through silence, lies, provocations, and when the victim finally reacts, they say, see, you're the problem. They point to the explosion, not the fuse, and suddenly the victim is apologizing again for their reaction, not the cause, and the cycle continues. This is how self-doubt is maintained, how the truth is distorted, how the victim becomes unsure of their own goodness. But reactions are not who someone is. They are messages, desperate messages, and they deserve to be traced back to their origin, not punished. But manipulators don't want origin stories, they want control. So they reframe the narrative. They say the victim is unstable, overreacting, crazy. And if the victim starts to believe that, the final trick unfolds: self-alienation. The person disconnects from their own instincts. Their body says no, but their mind says maybe. Their gut says leave, but their thoughts say try harder. And now the person cannot move. Not because they don't want to, but because they no longer know which voice to trust. This is the paralysis of psychological manipulation. Not chains, not cages, but noise, conflicting voices, internal war. And the only way out is to get quiet enough to hear the oldest voice, the one beneath the scripts, the one that existed before the conditioning. It's still there, buried maybe, but alive. And when that voice is heard even faintly, the system starts to collapse. Because real self-trust is incompatible with manipulation. It cannot coexist, it sees too clearly. And that clarity is not loud, it doesn't scream, it whispers. It says things like, "You're not crazy. That wasn't love. You're allowed to leave." And the whisper, once followed, leads to the next forbidden truth. Healing is not about becoming someone else. It's about remembering who you were before the world told you who to be, before survival painted over the essence, before performance replaced presence, and that remembering is not easy. It's not quick, but it is possible. And every small step toward it weakens the grip of every psychological trick that ever took hold. Because manipulation depends on forgetting one's worth, one's power, one's clarity. But once remembered, even briefly, the spell starts to break. And the spell doesn't break like glass. It unwinds, slowly. It loosens its grip with each honest moment, each time someone chooses to pause instead of perform, to rest instead of run, to say no even if their voice shakes. These small acts are not small. They are rebellion against every silent rule that once kept them stuck. Because those rules were never chosen. They were inherited. From parents who were too distracted to attune. From teachers who valued obedience over curiosity. From peers who punished difference. From systems that measured worth by output. And somewhere along the way, the person internalized a core belief. I must be good to be safe. I must be useful to be loved. This belief becomes the lens. And through it, every interaction becomes a test. Every mistake becomes a threat. Every boundary becomes a risk, so the person performs. They smile when they want to cry. They say yes when they mean no. They disappear to keep the peace. And the world applauds, calls them mature, easygoing, selfless, but inside they are starving, because no amount of external approval can fill the gap left by internal abandonment. This is the quiet tragedy, that so many people live entire lives as a performance, a mask, a role, and they don't even realize it, because they've never met the self beneath it. They've only met the version the world rewarded, and the world is not a fair judge. It rewards conformity, predictability, pleasantness. It fears depth, it avoids mess, and healing is messy. It is not linear, not graceful. It is rage and silence and softness and screaming. It is grieving the years spent asleep, the friendships maintained by shrinking, the love accepted in pieces. It is looking back and saying, I didn't deserve that. Not with bitterness, but with clarity. And clarity doesn't come from thinking harder. It comes from feeling, from being still long enough for the truth to catch up. And when it does, it burns. Not to punish, but to purify, to make space. Because healing isn't just about removing pain, it's about reclaiming space, mental space, emotional space, nervous system space, so that the body no longer flinches at silence, so that the mind no longer races to prove, so that the heart no longer shrinks around others. And this reclamation is not taught in school. It is learned through living, through breaking, through rebuilding. And along the way, the person begins to see that many of the psychological tricks were not personal, they were systemic. In a world designed to keep people producing, consuming, performing, manipulation is profitable. And peace is radical. So it's no surprise that many feel guilty when they rest, when they say no, when they choose themselves, because the system teaches that self-abandonment is noble, that burnout is a badge, that boundaries are rude, and so healing becomes lonely. At first. Because the old world no longer fits, but the new one hasn't formed. It's the in-between, the liminal space, and it feels like floating, like freefall, like uncertainty. But that space is sacred, because it is honest. It is the first place where the person is not pretending, not performing, not chasing, just being, and being after a lifetime of distortion is revolutionary. It is in this space that the nervous system begins to reset, that the mind begins to question old narratives, that the heart begins to soften, and from that softening comes a new kind of strength, one not built on control, but on trust. Trust in the self, trust in timing, trust in the quiet wisdom of the body. This strength doesn't roar, it whispers, it walks away when needed, it stays when aligned, it speaks when the cost is worth it. It doesn't need to prove, because it knows, and that knowing cannot be manipulated, it cannot be bought, it cannot be guilted. It is rooted in something deeper than approval. It is rooted in truth, and truth, once tasted, becomes intolerant of lies, even subtle ones, especially the ones told to the self. This is why healing often brings conflict, not because the person is angry, but because they've stopped pretending. They stop laughing at things that aren't funny. They stop agreeing to things that drain them. They stop justifying behavior that hurts. And the world, used to the old version, resists. It pushes back, says, "You've changed," and they have. They've remembered who they were before the world got loud, before the tricks took hold, before the masks were stitched in place. And this remembrance is not about becoming new, it's about becoming real. And the real self is not always pleasant, not always agreeable, but it is whole. And wholeness, unlike perfection, makes room for all parts: the fear, the joy, the grief, the rage, the silliness, the sadness. Nothing is exiled, everything is. Welcome, because nothing within is wrong. It is just misunderstood, misnamed, manipulated, until now. Now the light touches all of it, and the person, once fragmented, begins to feel intact, not fixed, not finished, but intact, able to hold contradiction without collapsing, able to face discomfort without fleeing, able to love without losing themselves. And that is the most forbidden trick of all, to live in truth, because truth does not serve the systems that profit from shame, but it serves the soul. It nourishes what manipulation starved, and it leads gently to something quieter than control, something softer than certainty, something deeper than approval. It leads to peace, and peace once touched makes everything else feel loud. The endless proving, the explaining, the chasing, the striving. It all becomes noise, like a crowd shouting in a language that once made sense but now feels foreign. Not wrong, just distant. Because something inside has softened, not collapsed, not given up, but loosened its grip. There is less need to win, less need to be right, less need to be seen by those who refuse to look. The need now is quieter. It's for truth, stillness, realness, and once someone begins to live from that space, the old games lose their grip. The manipulations that once worked, guilt, shame, silence, begin to fall flat. Not because they're no longer painful, but because the person can now name them. And naming is power, to say, this is not love, this is control. To say, this discomfort is not weakness. It's wisdom to say, this pattern is not fate, it's a story I've outgrown. These statements are not loud, but they are seismic. They shift the inner architecture. They rebuild the scaffolding of the self. Because for so long, the self was built around avoidance, around protection, around distortion. And now it's being rebuilt around presence, around integrity, around quiet knowing. This knowing is not arrogant. It doesn't assume it knows everything. It just knows itself. It knows when something feels off, when a smile is too sharp, when kindness is a leash, when flattery has teeth. It knows that not all attention is care, that not all criticism is truth, that not all love is safe. And this discernment, born not from books but from surviving, becomes the compass. It guides softly. It says yes with the full body. It says no without apology. And this clarity scares those who depend on confusion to maintain control. They will call it selfish, cold, unreasonable. But it is none of those things. It is precise, selective, grounded, and it honors both the self and the other. Because when someone no longer manipulates themselves, they stop tolerating it from others. And that creates ripples in families, in friendships, in systems. Because manipulation only survives in silence, in fog, in complicity, and when someone steps out of that fog, others feel it. Some follow, some fight it, some fade away, but all are affected. Because one person choosing truth disrupts the entire ecosystem of distortion. This is not easy. It is not glamorous. It often looks like sitting alone on a Friday night, feeling everything one once avoided. It looks like shaking hands, sending a message that says, "This isn't working for me." It looks like long walks with no answers, only questions. But eventually, it starts to look like freedom, like laughter that isn't forced, like rest that doesn't feel like guilt, like boundaries that don't come with shame. It starts to look like life, not the curated, filtered version, but the real one, with texture, with silence, with depth. And in that life, something unexpected returns, joy, not the manic, performative kind, but the soft kind, the kind that sits quietly in the chest, that hums beneath ordinary moments, that doesn't need an audience. This joy is not a reward, it's a return. To the self, to the present, to the parts once exiled in the name of survival. And this return doesn't erase the past. It integrates it. It says, that happened, and it mattered. And I grew from it. It doesn't need revenge or vindication, just peace. And peace is not passive, it is active. It is choosing not to engage in battles that lead nowhere. It is refusing to argue with people committed to misunderstanding. It is walking away not to punish but to preserve. This kind of peace is rare because it is self-sourced. It doesn't rely on others changing or apologizing or understanding. It comes from within, from knowing that one's worth was never up for debate, that one's intuition was never wrong, only overridden, that one's needs are not negotiable, they are sacred. And once this is embodied, manipulation has nowhere to land. It may knock, it may scream, but it cannot enter, because the door is now guarded by truth. Not walls, not armor, but clarity. And clarity, more than anything, is the antidote to psychological tricks. It names what is. It doesn't flinch. It doesn't justify. It simply sees. And in that seeing, it liberates. Not just the self, but everyone connected. Because truth ripples. It frees not just the speaker, but the listener. It creates space for others to reflect, to question, to awaken. Not always immediately, not always visibly, but inevitably. Because real truth doesn't demand, it invites. And that invitation is the beginning of a new world. One not built on manipulation, but on mutuality, on respect, on real connection. This is the quiet revolution, not in shouting, not in fighting, but in no longer consenting to what harms, in choosing peace over performance, reality over illusion, self over script. It's not flashy, it won't go viral, but it will heal, slowly, steadily, softly. And that healing, multiplied by many, becomes unstoppable, a collective remembering of what it means to be whole. And that is where we'll leave it tonight. With the whisper that started it all, what am I missing that I thought they could give me? And the answer now felt not just in the mind, but in the bones. Is this nothing? They were never the source. You are.